Hello, everyone. Welcome to another exciting chapter in terms of cognitive psychology. Today, we're going to talk about a very important idea and issue that we encounter within cognitive psychology, and that's really the issues of pattern recognition in terms of visual and auditory recognition, and then also talking about the importance of paying attention to particular tasks out in our environment. So when we think about cognitive psychology and we think about what it is that we're trying to do in our everyday world, remember that last week I mentioned this idea that we are information processors. So since we are information processors, that means that we are trying to take in information from our world, we're trying to process that information as efficiently as possible so that way we can then make decisions, have actions, and then be able to create knowledge-informed memories associated with whatever actions it is that we took. So in our previous lecture, you saw that in terms of me passing objects, tossing objects to my infant child and also to my wife, you notice that we go through this idea of they have to be able to recognize some aspect associated with the object, not necessarily in terms of saying this is what the particular object is, but at the end of the day, being able to identify some particular components associated with that object. So in terms of its size, in terms of its threat, that it may have towards the individual, in terms of the weight associated with it, and a whole lot of other factors that we're going to try to consider. But at the same time, many individuals tend to ignore the idea of how much attention really plays into that ability for us to be able to have those actions. So when we think about the perceptual process and we think about this idea of whenever it is that we're looking at a stimulus, when we think about this idea of looking at the stimulus, we have to think about this idea of we have to pay attention. So remember in our four-step model, right? So in our four steps, we had, I don't know what's going on, sorry. My computer's going a little crazy, guys. So in our four steps, and again here we'll do our four steps, the first step was that we have the stimulus out there in the environment, right? And the stimulus is there, but part of this idea of the stimulus being present out in my environment is that I have to pay attention. So if I don't pay attention to this particular object or to this particular stimulus that exists out here in my world, so if I don't actually look at it, if I don't hear it, if I don't touch it and smell it and taste it, nothing else happens here. So all of this breaks down, right? So all the other steps. So step number 2, which was electricity. Step number 3, which was bringing back a previous knowledge and having action, and then number 4, having knowledge. So none of these 3 steps will happen if I don't pay attention to this stimulus. So in other words, the stimulus will exist out there in the world, and then nothing else will happen. Many times we always hear that very philosophical question of, well, if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound? And the obvious answer is yes, it does really make a sound. It just doesn't make a sound for me, because if I'm not present and I can't pay attention to that sound, if I wasn't able to perceive that sound, so if that stimulus of a sound of that tree falling in the forest did not land in terms of my auditory receptors in this particular case, I'm not going to perceive that anything happened, but it did potentially happen for somebody else. It's like us saying, well, since I can't hear anything in China, I must then assume that China does not exist. Well, no, there are things that are happening in China. There's sounds everywhere out there, but just because I'm not there doesn't necessarily mean that they do not exist. But that's actually kind of part of the way that we function, is that we are very self-centered individuals. We really do care about ourselves before others. So again, going back to this idea of the survival mechanism, in terms of us trying to survive, we will do everything in our power to survive above anybody else. And it really does take a lot of effort for us to try to overcome that idea of we have to put others before ourselves, especially in emergency situations. So even in an idea such as this, as, well, are there sounds other places in the world? Well, yeah, of course there are sounds, but since I can't hear them, I normally am not thinking of them and I'm not paying attention to them because they are not providing enough of a stimulus that's strong enough for it to land on my receptor sites for me to be able to have the perceptual process occur. So if I don't have attention, nothing will happen with this stimulus and I'm not going to process this, okay? So if no attention occurs, no processing will happen. So I want to process information, okay? I want to do that because that's my job. My job is to process information. So for me to survive, I need to be able to process this information. So if I don't pay attention, so this aspect of the importance of attention, I will never get to the point where I'm going to recognize. When we talk about the idea of recognition, what does the term recognition mean? The term recognition means is that we looked in step number 3 at our previous knowledge, And then we extracted information from my previous knowledge and said, yes, I know what that object is. Okay? That's very, very important. This is very different. Recognition is very different from saying, I perceived the object. So I perceive the object. That's very, very different from recognition. Okay, they are not the same thing. So never get those two things confused. So if somebody says, yeah, I knew that the object was there, is very different from us saying, yes, I know what that object is. Those are very, very different statements. And sometimes we tend to get them confused, that people will say, well, if I know that an object exists out there, so if I heard that there was a sound, I should know what it is. And that's not always the case. Because in many instances, we hear things, we see things, we taste things, we smell things, we feel things that we don't know what they are. So in other words, you've had experiences where you've tasted some type of food and you said to yourself, I don't know what that is. It seems to be familiar, you know, I can kind of compare it to other things, but it's not that. So essentially what you did is you took in that experience, you perceived that experience, right? That stimulus, you perceived it. So when we talk about perception, we're talking about it landing on your receptor sites for your receptor system, right? So for your sensory system. So that stimulus lands on the receptor sites. At that point, once it is that we have electricity begin, we essentially say you've perceived that object. So you've identified that something exists there. But if you cannot say the object is this or that stimulus is this, you have not recognized it. Okay, that's very, very different. And we can have perception without recognition, but you can never have recognition without perception. Okay, very, very important statement. So you can have perception without recognition, but you cannot have recognition without perception. What does that mean? It means that I can perceive that something exists out there in the world, but I may not be able to tell you what it is. But I can never tell you the object is this or the stimulus is this without having perceived it. So I need to be able to perceive the object to be able to tell you what it is, because I need to go in order in these steps. So perception is going to exist at the point where we say electricity has begun to occur in terms of us processing that physical stimulus. And remember, electricity happens whenever it is that the stimulus, its physical properties, land on my receptor sites for my sensory system and create electrical impulses in the form of action potentials. Recognition will occur in step number 3 because remember in step number 3, we're extracting our previous knowledge and we're having action. So the action is based on the assumption that we know what that object is. So in the case, for instance, with my wife, that I threw that object to her, which was that makeup applicator, for her, she even claims, I saw that there was an object, I perceived it, essentially is what she's saying, but she's telling us I didn't know what it was. Why? Because we didn't allow her enough time to be able to process the information for her to say, yes, I know exactly what this object is. But she was able to say, I know that there is an object coming towards me. Now, in the case where she says, yes, now I know what that object is, it's a makeup applicator. Why is she able to do that? Because again, now she's gone through the process where the stimulus is existing. We have electricity occurring. Now she is able to process that information more accurately, spending some time paying attention to that object. Again, very, very important that she's paying attention to that object. And thus, she then is able to come to the conclusion, because she looks into her previous knowledge, into her memory store, and says, yes, I know what that object is. It is a makeup applicator. Perfect. So here we now have recognition. So it's very, very important to understand this relationship between them. So let's think of how this real world works, right? So in the real world, we're processing information all the time. So what if information and what we perceive cannot exist? So what happens in the case if what we say is occurring should not be possible? So are there situations where we say, well, this is what I thought should have happened, but it doesn't look like if that should have happened? And we're going to go through an example here very, very quickly so that way we can see how this actually works. In our particular case, it's very important for us to have the volume up in terms of your microphone, or in terms of your earphones, or in terms of your speakers, so that way you can hear what it is that we're going to be doing here. So out there in the real world, are there situations where we say the object is X, but in reality it wasn't X? And the answer is yes. There are situations that may happen. There are also situations where we say the object is X and we were correct. So sometimes we make mistakes in terms of identification, in terms of recognition of the object. So even in some instances, we process the information, but we're deceived. Why does that happen? Because sometimes there's competitions, especially when there's competitions between multiple systems, sensory systems. So think about food. Food is a great example. Sometimes food smells very, very gross, and you're like, oh, that smells disgusting. But then you try it, and you're like, that actually tastes pretty good. So here, there's this mismatch between your sensory systems, because one sensory system is telling you it does not smell good, it should not be good. But then you taste it and you're like, wow, that actually tasted pretty good. Or vice versa, that we say, wow, it smells great, and then you try it and you're like, but it does not taste good. So it smells fantastic, but it does not taste good. So there your sensory systems are competing, and they're essentially giving you different information. One of them is telling you, hey, you should have a great experience, while the other one's telling you, you should have a bad experience. The same thing can happen between our eyes and our ears. Our eyes may tell us one thing, but our ears tell us something different. So let's look at this example. So everyone ready? Make sure you turn up your speaker so that way you can hear it. All right, so here we go. So we have these two objects that are existing here. We have these two little green balls that we have in our corners. And now what we're going to see happen is that they're going to start moving towards each other, and a sound should or should not occur. Okay, everyone ready? Here we go. Okay, perfect. So in this particular case, when we went through this example, you'll notice that these two green balls started going towards each other, and we have this sound. Now, when this sound occurred, your reaction should have been what? What should have happened between these balls? Should the balls have crossed each other, or did the balls bounce off each other based on the sound? And here your answer should be, well, they should have bounced off of each other. So again, we'll do this one more time. So here we go. Okay, so there, while you're looking at this example, you should be processing that information saying, okay, they should have bounced off of each other because I heard the sound of them colliding, they should have bounced off of each other. Now here, let's look at another example, and again, a green ball, now we have a red ball, so that way we can look at the differences between the two, and now we're going to run through our example. Okay, so in this particular case, there is no sound. There is no colliding sound effect there, and you'll notice that the red ball crosses the green ball, right? So they go past each other. So here they did not hit each other. Perfect, right? Because here now your eyes and your ears are confirming that for you. So in our previous example, our ears and our eyes are telling us they collided, they should have bounced off of each other, because in the physical world that should happen. Here now, we have the objects crossing each other. So in the physical world, there was no auditory sound of them colliding, so it confirms what we saw. So they crossed each other, nothing happened, perfect. Now we're going to go through this example again. So a green ball and a red ball. Okay, so now we've added the collision sound. In this particular case now, if we were only listening to this and not looking at this example, you would have assumed that since we have the collision sound, these two balls should have bounced off of each other, right? Because that should be the correct assertion. That should be the correct recognition that when the sound occurs, we would have objects hitting each other and bouncing off. Because when objects hit each other, they do not continue through, but rather they move away from each other because they've collided. Here now, we notice that there's a mismatch between what we've seen and what we've heard. What did we see? We saw them crossing each other, but we still had a sound of them hitting each other. That's problematic for us. There's this mismatch between what it is that we've seen and what it is that we've experienced in terms of auditory perception. Now, why is this so important for us? This is important for us because in the real world, this happens a lot. That we see things and we're like, what? Like, what happened? Like, we saw it, but it didn't hear like it. You know, it didn't sound like that was supposed to happen. Or we heard something, but then you look and you're like, oh, that's completely different. So think of, for instance, this happens a lot, like if you've ever had like a branch that's scraping against your window at night and you have a very, very dark room, it almost sounds like if someone's like scratching at the window and you start getting freaked out because that's the recognition that you hear, that in a scary movie when, you know, the witch or the monster scratches the window with their long nails, it produces that sensation of fear. Well, for you, you hear that and it creates a sensation of fear, but then you look at the window and you're like, oh, it was just a branch. It was a branch, you know, scraping the window. Oh, okay, yeah, I should have never had that reaction. But here, if you base yourself on your sound alone, it would give you that reaction because that's the recognition that you've had. But if you look at it and you were to think to yourself, well, that's a sound, it shouldn't match up because it doesn't correspond to your previous experiences of having a witch or a monster scratching at the window in a movie. So here, same thing is happening. So what's the point of this? The point is sometimes we can't just trust one sensory system. What we have to do is we have to rely on all our sensory systems together to really make the identification process. So here, what's the correct conclusion then? That there really is no collision occurring, but rather the collision is occurring in other objects, but in this particular example, there really is no collision occurring. So other objects may be existing out in the world that are colliding and bouncing off of each other, but with these two, it's physically impossible because the red ball goes right past the green ball in this particular case. So again, we have to think about using our sensory systems together and then also trying to come to the most logical conclusion, especially based on the physical properties of our world. Very, very important way of us using this idea of pattern recognition. So in the real world, we have to perceive the world around us. That's our goal. We have to perceive the world around us. To perceive the world around us, again, we come to this idea of perception versus recognition. Remember that with perception, we're talking about us being able to identify if a stimulus is out there in the physical world or not. So in other words, we have things like form perception, where all that we say is, yes, there is an object there, or no, there is no object there. I really can't give you more information than that. I may give you some details about maybe the size, about the intensity in terms of the sound amplitude, or the light intensity in terms of illumination, or things of that nature, but I really can't tell you what it is. So I couldn't tell you, oh, that is a green soccer ball that is from Walmart. I couldn't be able to say those things to you because I don't know that information at this point. All I'm telling you is that yes, something is there, but that's it. I can't give you more details than that. Recognition then has to come into play, where now I have to tell you the specific category associated with that object. So here, now we're actually telling you that is a green ball. Perfect. Or that is a green soccer ball. Or that is a soccer ball. Or that is a ball. You use general categories to be able to identify what that object is. So there's a clear differentiation between perception and recognition. And again, remember that relationship between the two, that perception can occur without recognition, so we can say something is out there without knowing what it is, but we can never say that is what the object is without having perceived it. I need to be able to perceive it to be able to have recognition occur. I cannot skip steps in the perceptual process. So for instance, physicians know how to treat measles, but doesn't know how to recognize it. Well, then I'm useless, right? So if I don't know how to recognize measles, but I know how to treat it, awesome, right? That would be a terrible doctor, though. I need to know how to identify measles and then treat it appropriately. Because imagine if your doctor says, well, I know how to treat measles, I think you have measles. Well, are you sure I have measles? No, because I really don't know how to, identify if you have measles or not. But I'm just assuming that you do, so I'm just going to go ahead and treat you in this particular fashion. Well, no, right? I mean, that's a terrible doctor. Same thing would happen to us. If out there in the real world you said, that car was speeding, and you were like, well, which car? Oh, I don't know. I didn't see a car. Well, then how did you know that the car was speeding if you didn't even see a car? So here, we have to make logical conclusions in terms of the way that we act in the world. So without recognition, you cannot bring knowledge into the world. This is very, very important also. If I don't know how to react, so if I don't know how to recognize something, I can't react appropriately. So if you notice with my daughter, with the 1-year-old, her hand movements were fantastic. So when we threw the object at her, the little cap from the marker, she didn't really act accordingly. She didn't try to cup her hands in a very, very small fashion and try to catch it because it's such a small object, but rather she kind of extended her arms out, because normally what objects do you toss at an infant? You generally toss larger things like a larger ball. So here, things that they're able to grasp with general motor movements, so very grandiose motor movements, not fine motor movements like tossing a little object at them. So in her particular case, she had the inappropriate action because her hand movements did not correspond to the size of that object. So here, the next time around though, if we were to do it, she should start now mimicking a behavior that corresponds closer to the object size. Like in the case with my wife, that I threw the object at her. So here she made an assumption before I even threw the object at her because she saw that the object was in my hand. So she automatically knew that object cannot be larger than whatever it is, than whatever his fist would be. So that object cannot be any larger than that. But for instance, I could have put like one of those, kind of like one of those little snakes that come in the bottle, and you open the bottle up and the snake kind of explodes out. I could have potentially done that, and she would have freaked out, and her hand movements would have changed drastically because she would have tried adapting to the situation. So here, when we think about this aspect of recognition, recognition is going to tell me how to act. But there are going to be situations where I don't know how to act because I don't recognize the situation. So this happens a lot, for instance, if you've ever gone to like a cocktail party. If you've never been to a cocktail party, and now they're asking you to put on a very nice suit or put on a tuxedo and go and mingle with these people that you've never talked to and you may not have potentially anything in common with them, it's very, very difficult to act appropriately because you don't know how you're supposed to act because your situations in terms of parties have always been very, very different. That here you're just hanging out, you're talking about the weather, you're talking about sports, you're talking about all these other things or about classes, but now the situation changes drastically that your ability to act accordingly in that world is very, very different. But the next time that you would then go to a cocktail party, you would already have an experience that you've based yourself off of and say, okay, generally this is the way people act. This is the way I should then potentially act. So very, very important. So pattern recognition. What does it mean for us to actually have pattern recognition? Pattern recognition is essentially the process by which a person uses fragmentary pieces of sensory stimulation to create a higher level identification of what he or she has just experienced. And if you're asking yourself, what does that mean? It essentially means I look at pieces of the puzzle and try to make a decision as to what I'm seeing. Or what is it that I'm experiencing? So think about making a puzzle. When you have all those puzzle pieces and they're all just spread around, the puzzle doesn't seem to make sense. But once it is that you grab one puzzle piece, now the puzzle seems to make a little bit more sense than it did before with all the scattered pieces. Now you put two puzzle pieces together. Now it starts making more sense. 3 puzzle pieces, 4, and you start building the image around all the puzzle pieces. And every time you add in a new puzzle piece, the fragmentary pieces, it now starts making more of sense in terms of the overall picture. And that's essentially what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to look at all the small pieces and trying to identify what the overall larger object is. So I only have fragments of what that situation is or about what that object may be, and I'm trying to come to a decision as quickly as I can to be able to recognize that object and use it appropriately also in my world. So here it's very important for us to use those fragments, because those fragments can dictate for us very, very quickly what that object should be. So in other words, I don't even need to have the entire object. I can have pieces of the object and be able to identify what that object should be. Very, very important. And here, that's a key part to our survival, that I don't have to wait around to identify all the fragments of the object to identify what the object is, but rather I can have pieces of the object and say, that's what the object is, and I should have a reaction just as this. Now, what does that mean for us in the real world? It means that in some situations, I may act incorrectly because I made a decision too quickly. So based on the information that was being given, you act too quickly and you have a reaction. So think about it in a situation such as the following. Let's say that someone calls you and he says, hey, I have something very, very important to tell you. The first thing that you're probably going to think of is you're going to be, oh man, it's bad news, because the way that they just told it to you, right? The tone of their voice indicates to you that it's probably something pretty bad. So if it's a relationship that you're having with somebody and somebody says, hey, I have to call and tell you, we need to talk and we need to talk about something that's very, very important. I can't not talk about it. The first thing that you may say is, oh man, they want to break up with me. You want to break up with me? Why do you want to break up with me? I can't believe it. And the other person is like, what? No. I have a wedding to go to and I need you to go with me. And, I hadn't asked you and the wedding is tomorrow. Sorry, I kind of forgot to tell you. And you say to yourself, oh man, like, why did you say it in that fashion? And you may even get upset. But ultimately, what happened? You took fragments of the puzzle, made a conclusion, acted upon that conclusion, but then you didn't have the right pieces of the puzzle. You should have let the person finish, even after using that I will give it to you, inadequate expression of there's something important that I need to talk to you about. At that point, you should then start drawing your conclusions appropriately because you now start getting more and more and more of the puzzle pieces. So very, very important for us. So ultimately, we're going to take information in, we're going to attenuate to the basic components of that information and start trying to recognize it as best as I possibly can, based on the pattern. So in other words, based on what I'm experiencing as the information is coming in, I'm going to start drawing conclusions. Now, granted, I can change my conclusions as more and more information is coming in. So here, what you should do is you should say, okay, so are they breaking up with me? Are they not breaking up with me? So all these thoughts start going through your mind, but now you let them continue on. And as they talk more and more and more, you start realizing, oh, okay, they don't want to break up with me. They want to invite me to a wedding, and they were, feeling awkward about inviting me, whatever the case may be. And now you start making the right conclusions. So as more and more fragments start coming in, our behavior is going to change accordingly. Very, very important for us. Now, when we have this aspect of pattern recognition, the problem sometimes exists at the perceptual level because, again, we're making the incorrect judgments because sometimes what we're perceiving is not the right thing because we're not allowing ourselves to have enough of the information being present. So how is it that we ultimately accomplish the feats of perception and identify experiences? Typically, we have two methods by which we identify our previous experiences based on the information that's coming in. We can use what's called bottom-up processing, or what we also call bottom-up analysis. Bottom-up analysis is essentially where you look at all the tiny pieces of the puzzle and start formulating a response, so an action, or those tiny pieces of the puzzle start extracting previous experiences, previous knowledge for you to be able to decide what it is. So in other words, each one of the little puzzle pieces functions like a part of the puzzle, and what it's doing is it's building upon itself. That's what bottom-up processing is, that we take all the little basic features, all the little basic components, and we start putting them together, and every single time we get a new piece of the puzzle, it starts getting more and more and more clear towards the picture. But here, I may not know what the picture is, but every single time I have another puzzle piece, it starts getting closer and closer and closer to the actual answer. Now, we can have bottom-up processing occur where I don't know what the picture is, but I use all the basic pieces to get to the picture, to get to that knowledge. Okay? So here when I talk about the picture is what I know what that information is. It's my knowledge that I've stored. Top-down processing, on the other hand, or what we also call top-down analysis, is where we already know what the picture is, and then the pieces of the puzzle fit in. Okay? And that's very, very important. I'm going to show you an example of this in just a couple of minutes here. So first, let's look at this idea of bottom-up processing. Let's go through an example. So with bottom-up processing, we are taking the basic features of the stimulus and working our way up. Okay, very, very important. We're taking the basic features of the stimulus and working our way up. How is this going to work? Well, ultimately, it's going to work in the case where we start bringing information in, because remember, I'm an information processor. Information is coming in, coming in, coming in. And what I start doing is I start analyzing that information as those puzzle pieces start coming in. And once every single puzzle piece starts coming in, I start formulating a reaction because I'm going through the perceptual process. So every time I start getting more and more information from the stimulus, it creates an electrical impulse, it goes to my brain, to the appropriate area for recognition, and it starts getting processed. So even though the wrong information may get activated in my brain when I'm extracting that previous knowledge, it doesn't really matter, because I'm doing exactly what I'm built to do, to process information and make a decision. My purpose is to have an action, so I need to act appropriately. How do I act appropriately? Well, based on the information that I have, a little or as much as I have. But as I start getting more and more and more, it starts getting a clearer picture and activating the right pieces of the puzzle. Now, if you're asking yourself, well, why don't we just wait for the entire picture to be given to you and then make a decision? It's like saying, we'll just wait for the puzzle to make itself and then look at the puzzle and be like, oh, it's done. I know what it is. When the answer is, you have to work on the puzzle to make it make sense. Same thing is happening as to here in the real world. Same thing is happening to us here in the real world. That we need to work on the information continuously to be able to come to the conclusion. So let's look at an example here. So I'm going to draw something, and you need to identify what this object is, okay? So I already have an idea of what my object should be. It's your job to figure out what object I am drawing. Everyone ready? Okay, so here we go. Okay. Now tell me what my object is that I have in my mind. And more than likely you're looking at that and being like, I don't know, it's a C? I don't know, it's a letter? I don't know, you're going to write a word? Who knows, right? So now, there we go, okay. So now you're looking at that and you're like, a poorly written D? You probably still haven't figured out what it is. Okay, everyone ready? Now you're looking at this and you're like, okay, I don't know, apostrophes and a poorly written letter D or P or Q, or I don't know what you did. And now I start drawing a little bit more. And now it should start making a little bit more sense. So you're like, oh, okay, maybe I know what that is. And then I finish off the coffee cup, right? And here's the little vapors that are coming off, the little steam that's coming out of my coffee cup. So here's my handle, here's the mug, and here's the vapor, right? So you look at that and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, that totally now makes sense. But when you looked at the individual pieces, you were like, I have no idea. Because what you're doing is you're doing the right thing. You're looking at each puzzle piece and you're trying to make a conclusion as to what that object was. You're trying to recognize what that object is with very limited information. This happens to us in our real world, that we have limited pieces of the puzzle, limited information that's coming in, and we're still trying to act accordingly. Imagine like driving down the expressway, and here you're driving and you look at the car next to you and you're like, is that car going to come into my lane? Is it not going to come into my lane? And you have very few pieces of the puzzle to make that decision, because you're approaching that car and you start noticing that the car starts kind of swerving a little bit into your lane, and you're like, the car's going to come in. I should slam on my brakes. I should move over to another lane. Who knows? But then you pass that car, you make the decision, and you're like, no, they're not going to. And you pass the car, and then you're like, ah, look at that, they never came into my lane. Or you pass the car and then they go into your lane and you're like, oh man, I was right. I just kind of skimmed by a little bit. But if you had more pieces of the puzzle, you could have made the decision more appropriately. Because if you would have seen that car start trying to come into your lane, they would have put their blinker on. They even turned to look and you saw them turning to look. You would have said, oh, that guy totally has the intention of getting into my lane. I'm going to back off the accelerator a little bit and brake, or I'm going to switch off to another lane, or I'm going to honk at them, whatever the case may be. So here we need more pieces of the puzzle. Now, there's a clear difference though if we now start going in the opposite direction. What if we use top-down processing? Top-down processing is already knowing what's going to happen or already knowing what the picture is, and then us looking at the pieces of the puzzle and saying, yep, those totally fit. So in other words, it's me saying to myself, I already know that this is going to happen, and then everything that happens up to that point fits into my model. So think of it like this. Think of it like your friend comes to you and tells you, hey, Billy, Mary's going to break up with you. And Billy now starts thinking about, oh no, well, what's going to happen? Why is Mary going to break up with me? And then Mary calls him. And Mary says, hey, Billy, I need to talk to you. It's something really, really important. I need to talk to you. So now Billy's freaking out. He's like, oh, you see, I knew it. I already knew that she was going to break up with me. Somebody, so-and-so told me, Janie told me that Mary was going to break up with me. And now Mary just called me and told me this. Yeah, she's totally going to break up with me. And then you go and talk to Mary, and Mary's like, look, Billy, I don't know how to tell you this. And you're like, oh, she's totally going to break up with me. And Billy keeps saying, are you going to break up with me? You're breaking up with me. And Mary's like, you know what? Yeah, I totally am going to break up with you. How did you know that? Oh, somebody else already told him that. And everything that Mary was saying was fitting into Billy's idea of her breaking up with him. But at the same time, Billy could potentially keep saying, you're going to break up with me. You're going to break up with me. And Mary could be like, no, man, I'm not going to break up with you. All I'm going to do is, I want to see if you want to go to a movie together a little bit later tonight. Oh, okay, I totally was not expecting that. So here, the individual already goes in with knowledge, and then every piece of the puzzle fits into that model. So we have expectations, we already have context, we already have interpretations or biases that are leading us to those conclusions. Same thing happens when we go on a date with somebody. Imagine like somebody tells you, hey, you're gonna go on a blind date with so-and-so. And they go, well, but do know that that person is a jerk. You know, they always talk about themselves, they're super self-centered, they're arrogant. And then you go on the date with them, anything that that person does and or says fits into the idea of them being arrogant, self-centered, is a jerk, and so on and so forth. So they're, oh, you see, totally fits in. Yep, everything that they did, you know, fits into that idea of them being a jerk, being self-centered. That's why it's better if you're going to go on a blind date that no one tells you anything about that person, so that way you can make your own judgment. In other words, you use bottom-up processing to come to the point of recognition. So potentially your date may be a jerk. They may be self-centered and may be, very arrogant. And the things that they do lead you to that conclusion. But all those pieces of the puzzle, those behaviors led you to the conclusion of them being arrogant and a jerk as a whole. Not the other way around, that you expected them to be a jerk and now their behaviors confirm. Because if you go in with the idea of them being a jerk and they are not a jerk, it doesn't matter what they do, they're a jerk. So ultimately, we can really use these contextual factors to really drive us to being able to decide what's going to happen. So our expectations are going to influence what we perceive in terms of the person. So in other words, my recognition or my idea, my bias, my knowledge already is leading me to believe that this is going to happen. Okay? Very, very important. Throughout the semester, we're going to revisit these ideas of top down and bottom up. Very, very important. Now, in bottom-up processing, we look at this idea of how to identify objects, or how to actually get to the point of recognition, so identifying them by their category name. When we look at bottom-up processing, there's actually 4 different theories or 4 different ways that we can really get to the point of where we're using bottom-up processing for the process of identification and recognition of objects. So the 4 theories that we have are what we call distinctive features theory, recognition by components theory, template matching theory, and prototype theory. And we're going to talk about each one of them in just a bit here. So when we look at this idea of bottom-up processing, and this is just another example of bottom-up processing, we can look at something like the following to try to draw a conclusion. Now here ultimately, if you look at the idea of pointillism in terms of art is that we make art out of just dots, right, or out of points. Lots of artists use this kind of a format. Seurat uses this kind of pointillism or this art movement to be able to make their art, or he used to be able to use it to make his art. But ultimately the point is that you're supposed to ignore all the little dots and focusing on the meaning. Okay, that's really the idea of pointillism. You look at the whole picture, but the dots themselves should lead you to the conclusion. But if you look at the individual dots in pointillism don't really have any meaning because they're just these individual features, these individual puzzle pieces that don't really carry a lot of meaning. They're just a bunch of color. But when you take a step back and you look at everything put together, that's where the meaning really comes through. And that's the conclusion that we're trying to get to. That's the point that we're trying to work out in the real world. That I have all these little tiny features that are existing out there, but I don't need to focus in on each one of them. I need to focus in on the meaning, the whole. That's what I need to do. I need to look at the whole picture. I don't need to look at every single individual puzzle piece. But in some instances, that's what I'm given. I'm starting off by giving all the little individual puzzle pieces and then working my way up to recognizing and understanding the meaning of the whole picture. So very, very important that we have to understand the whole idea. We have to understand the meaning because that's what I'm trying to get to the recognition part. But sometimes I can avoid looking at all the individual puzzle pieces. And sometimes it's necessary for me to look at all the individual puzzle pieces because I need to work on them to get to the point of recognition. So when are we going to do this? It depends. All semester long you'll hear me use this. It depends. Why? Because it does depend. It depends on what you're doing and it depends on if you already know that information. If you already knew the information, you already knew what the picture should be, you can ignore all the little basic dots. But if you didn't know what the picture was, you may need to examine all the little dots a little bit closer to be able to come to the identification of what that object may potentially be. So when we look at bottom-up processing, The first theory that we're going to talk about here is the theory of distinctive feature theory proposed by Gibson back in '69. A little bit of an older theory, but still very relevant in terms of the way that we discuss this idea of bottom-up processing. But ultimately what Gibson proposed was the following: that all complex perceptual stimuli are composed of distinctive and separable attributes called features. So in other words, overall larger objects are made up of these individual features. So in other words, just like pointillism, the overall larger picture is made up of these individual points. Yet, what we need to do is we need to come to the meaning, to the actual meaning as a whole. I don't really need to look at each one of the individual features. So Gibson would make the argument here that if we look at the word features, okay, this particular term right here, features, Gibson would make the argument that features is made up of a bunch of different features in itself. So let's first start looking at the F. What is the F made out of? The F is made out of first this particular feature, then we have this particular feature, and then this particular feature here, right? So that then forms the F for us. And we look at it and we say, oh yes, that is now an F, right? And you could say that absolutely, yeah, it definitely looks like an F, or as best as my drawing skills can get to being the F here, right? Because my F looks a little bit different the way I draw my F. I sometimes draw Fs like that. Sometimes I draw Fs like that. So here, what Gibson is saying is, look, it doesn't really matter how you draw your F. Your F is made up of a bunch of distinctive features, okay? Each one of those little features is leading you to the whole, leading you to the overall larger meaning of the F. So the same thing happens with our letter A and with everything else. We start looking at the pattern that is being given to us by all the distinctive features. So the more and more features that I have available to me, the closer I get to my meaning. Because technically somebody could draw that and somebody could say, oh, it's an F. But hey, it could also be a candy cane, right, for all I know. You know, and typically candy canes are drawn, you know, sometimes like that. But if you draw a candy cane like this, you would say maybe a candy cane, or it may be an R, a pretty large lowercase r, right, as well. But somebody may look at that and say, yep, F. That's the conclusion that they draw. So every single time, Gibson argued, is that every time we get a feature, it starts trying to get to the point where we recognize the object, because it starts activating ideas that use these features. So according to Gibson, Gibson says the following: in your memory store, you have an object that is this, right? Your F. So in your memory store, that F is made up individually of that feature, and that feature. So anytime this feature comes up, this feature or this feature is available to you in terms of the stimulus, it should activate F. Okay? But Gibson also argued the following. Let's say that you have an R in your memory. R and this feature have very similar features. So R is made up also of something that looks like that and something that looks like that. So according to Gibson, since they're very, very similar to each other and they have similar features, they're going to activate both. So it's going to activate the R and it's also going to activate the F because they have similar features. But now what starts to happen? They start competing for activation. As more and more features start coming out, we now start drawing more and more appropriate conclusions. So according to Gibson, if we were to stop here after this feature was given to us, we would say it's an R because that's the one that won. Okay, that's the object, the stimulus in my memory that won over here. Because here, this particular object is saying, hey, to complete the F, I still need other features. I'm only being given this, then it must not be an F. But F was activated because it had similar features to this object here. So here we have this idea that we're going through this checklist of critical features. I'm going through and I'm trying to make this decision as to what is the most appropriate because I need to be able to make the right conclusion out there in the real world. So imagine reading and you come across this particular feature and you say it's an F, but in reality it's an R. Well, now you were supposed to read and you wrote feed. Well, that's a problem. So here we need to draw the correct conclusions in these particular cases. Right? And again, Gibson here is arguing that we start having this kind of competition occurring for us in those particular situations. So Gibson also proposed that there's this big difference between global and local features. According to Gibson, in Navon figures, large letters are composed of smaller letters. So in our particular case, we have the letter H composed of H's, H composed of S's, S composed of H's, and S composed of S's. According to Gibson, when participants heard the letter H, they responded yes equally quicker no matter what the small letter here was. So these low-level features did not actually affect the global judgment. However, when deciding the name of the small letters, they were affected by the name of the capital letter. So the global features seem to be processed first. Now here, ultimately what this means is the following. So when we are giving people the letter H, just as we have here, and this letter H, they were equally as fast in terms of saying, yes, I know that this is an H. It's an H. It doesn't matter if the H is made up of H's or the H is made up of S's. But here, if we say, what is the letter made out of? So here you're supposed to respond saying, it's made up of S's, it's made up of H's here, and S's here, and I just demonstrated this result. In this particular case, what we needed to do is we were supposed to say it's made up of H's, not made up of an S. So here, my brain essentially did exactly what Gibson proposed, that it looked at the overall larger feature, so it looked at the overall larger picture and concluded it's an S. But in reality, what I was supposed to do is I was supposed to say it's an H. So going back to our pointillism example here, what Gibson was proposing is that if we were to ask you, what is this made up of? You were much more likely to say it's a painting, saying the whole picture, saying the object as a whole, rather than it's made up of little dots. So you're much more likely to identify the whole picture because the whole picture is much more important than the individual features. So here, the global features much more important than the local features. So here, again, with the H's, is this an H? Yes, it is. Is this an H? Yes, it is, because that's exactly what we're proposing here. It's much more likely for us to be able to say, yes, it is actually an H because the overall larger picture is of an H. Here now, if we say, well, what is this object made out of? You're supposed to say S's is much more likely that you're going to say in this particular case H rather than an S, because it's much more harder to be able to do that because you're looking at the overall larger picture rather than the individual local features in this particular case. Now, our next theory here that we have is this idea of recognition by components. Recognition by components theory was given to us by Biederman back in the 80s, and Biederman essentially proposed that pattern recognition is going to be based on 3D objects that they called geons. Geons were essentially these geometric ions that had the basic components in all objects. So according to Biederman, all objects had these basic geons, and they're 36 primitive shapes, these 36 primitive geons. And essentially, identification of the object was going to be based on these geons, these configurations of these geons. So we have 36 basic ones, and according to Biederman, all objects, no matter what it is that we experience out in the world, is made up of these basic geons. So as we start combining geons together, we start then creating the object. We start creating that 3D visual representation of that object, and we start approximating recognition. So ultimately here, rather than us having distinctive features like Biederman proposed, that Gibson proposed in distinctive feature theory, Biederman here is proposing now that rather than looking at distinctive features, we now have these geons. And all objects, no matter what the object is, has these 36 primitive features, okay? So ultimately, these 36 features, or these 36 geons that we have, in this particular case, these objects, are ultimately, when we combine them together, going to lead us to recognition. So here you'll notice that we have 5 of the basic geons that Biederman proposed. And according to Biederman, you can rotate them, you can shift them, you can make them in any way you want in your 3D world, but they're going to be there. So ultimately, if you look at an old school rotary phone, according to Biederman, the old school rotary phone is made up of 3 geons. The 3 geons are number 5. Whoops, sorry, there you go. No, there we go. Number 5, which is this object here, kind of this curved shape here that we have. So it's going to be the handle of the phone. We also have number 2, which is this object here, right? You would say, well, maybe it's 1 instead of number 2. Potentially, right? For Biederman in this particular example, they decided that it was number 2 rather than number 1. I would argue that it's closer to number 1 than number 2, but for me, that's just the geon that may be working for me. And then number 3 is the cylinder shape here that we have. You'll also notice that this lamp also uses 3, just as the rotary phone does. Over here, the coffee cup also uses 3. The bucket uses 3 in different shapes, right? So in different widths, if you want to call it that, or in different orientations as well, but at least it's still similar shapes. So according to Biederman, recognition by component was that we are recognizing objects by breaking down the geons. So according to Biederman, we look at the geons individually, we start combining them together, and as we combine them together, they start leading us to the recognition of my object. So here, having those 36 basic geons ultimately was a method by which we could be able to correctly recognize the objects of interest in our particular case. So in a situation such as this, Biederman proposed that we could look at a flashlight, which is here demonstrated to us in letter A, by basic geons, right? So this is the whole picture, right, that we have here. According to Biederman, as more and more geons are presented to us, it's easier for us to be able to identify what that object is. So here in A, as I'm able to see the whole picture, according to Biederman, I have all the geons represented to me that are necessary to make this flashlight, right? So I have number 3, I have number 4, and so on and so forth, right? That make up this particular object of a flashlight. So according to Biederman, what I'm doing is I'm looking at all these geons, I'm putting them together and saying then all those geons together fit into making a flashlight in this particular case. But now you'll notice in B and also in C, we start having some of these geons being masked, right? So we start seeing them being covered up. So in A, we have the entire object. So we have all the geons available to us. In B, the object is actually deliberately obscured by visual noise. So in other words, it's being masked, but we're still able to identify some of the particular edges. So you can look towards the back and be like, okay, I can see that cylindrical shape over there. So I can start deciding that it probably is something like a number 3, right, in terms of the geon. We also start seeing kind of like the button, and we also start seeing the top part or the top portion of the flashlight. So you may even say in B, well, you know, it's a little bit hard for me to identify that it's a flashlight, but it looks like a flashlight. If you look now at C, some of the key geons are really masked in this particular case. So there's more noise there. So here it's actually a lot more difficult for you to identify that it looks like the object in A, so that it looks like a flashlight. You can still compare it and say like, yeah, okay, it's still a flashlight. But if we were to only give you C and cover up A and also cover up B, and we only gave you C initially, you could look at that and be like, I don't know, it may look like a drawer, it may look like a brick, I don't know, the top of a house, it may look like a chimney kind of thing. And according to Biederman, what's happening is the information that we're giving you is enough for you to be able to formulate some geons. When you combine those geons together, it starts activating the appropriate mechanism, the appropriate object in terms of your memory store. So just like what Gibson proposed, that the basic features were activating objects in our memory, geons are doing the same thing, but the big difference between distinctive feature and recognition by components, distinctive feature assumes these basic features and that all objects are made up of these distinctive features. Here, Biederman is proposing that all objects are made up of these 36 geons in this particular case. So here, we're still doing the same process. We're using the individual fragments that we have to lead to the conclusion of what that information is. If we started out at C, you would say things like, it's a brick, it may be the top of a house, who knows? We now give you B, more information is given. Okay, now it starts looking a lot clearer. It may look like something like maybe like a car or like an axle in a vehicle, or I really don't know, like a toy piece maybe. And then we give you A, where now everything is present. now there is only one object that it could potentially be. So here in A, you're never going to say, it looks like a house, it looks like a train, it looks like a brick. Well, no, it looks like a flashlight, because according to Biederman, now that we have all the geons available to us, we have the correct identification being given to us. Number 3, template matching theory. Template matching theory is a quite interesting theory, and it really involves this idea of storing information individually. And this is very, very important for us. So with template matching theory, we have this idea that essentially what we do is we store away an unlimited number of patterns, and we have tons and tons and tons of copies that correspond to every object that we've ever experienced. So very interestingly with template matching theory proposes the following, that if we were to have a letter, such as the letter F, template matching theory would say, I have to create a template, one single template for this one, for this particular object that I'm going to have an experience for. If I now have this is a brand new object now that I have to learn. So if I encounter this object here out in the real world, I would look at that and say to myself, well, I don't know what that is, because this is the only object that I know that looks like an F. This is not an F because it does not match up to my template. So here template matching theory would say, I now have to learn that this is also an F. Well, what if I do this? Template matching theory would say, well, that's another F. What if we do that? Another F, etc., etc., etc. So according to template matching theory, we literally create templates for each experience that we've had out there in our world. And what we now do is we encounter a situation where we come about this and we say, okay, does this object meet this criteria? No. What about this one? No. What about this one? No. It does meet up with that one. Perfect. That is a letter F. So according to template matching theory, what we are continuously doing is we are looking at objects in our world and matching them up against templates that we have stored in our memory bank. Now, one of the big issues here that we come across with the issue of template matching theory is that it's highly impractical. Think about storing files on your flash drive. If you were to store a file on your flash drive every single time you made a change to a document, and here any change, so you press the letter A on a Word document, you save it as a file, and then you go back and you say P, another file, P, another file, L, another file, E, another file. According to template matching theory, that's essentially what we're doing. Every single time you have any modifications to any file or any object out there that you have in the world, you now have to create a brand new file on your hard drive. So you have now, how many files would that be? 5 files, because we have 5 letters. So for Apple, we would have now 5 files for Apple, or 5 files that had A, and then AP, APP, APPL, APPLE. So now we have 5 files for just Apple. And now what you have to do anytime you encounter Apple, the word Apple out there in the world, you better hope that it looks just like the way that you stored that file of Apple, because if not, it's never going to get recognized. Or, for instance, a car. According to template matching theory, we have to have one file or one template for each kind of car that's out there. Well, what if the car changes in terms of the color? So it's still a Mustang, same year, 2014, one was in black and one was in green. According to template matching theory, I now have to have a separate template or a separate file being created that is only for that particular car. If another Mustang 2014 comes up and it's in blue, okay, then I have to create another one. It's never going to get matched up to any of the previous ones that we've had, even though they have very similar features. According to template matching theory, it's never going to get recognized because it does not fit in exactly the way that it was that I had stored it. So it's very, very impractical, because it would mean that we would take a lot of time having to search through all these templates that we've created out in our world to be able to identify them. So we would never really be able to manage something such as handwriting from person to person. Imagine that we would look at somebody's handwriting, somebody that we had never met before, and we would essentially say, I can't read anything that you say. I have to learn it all over again, how to read and how to interpret handwriting, because I don't have your particular handwriting. But we don't do that. Rather, what we do is we look at a person's handwriting and we try to match it up as best as we can with our previous experiences. And then if we do have questions, we may have to ask them, and we may say, okay, for that person, we're going to interpret it as this. And then you're going to store that information. And if anyone else ever comes about and writes something similar to that, we would still store it as such. So here, a very, very impractical view, but yet still an idea that we have in terms of the way that we would recognize objects. Now, our last theory here that I'm going to introduce is the idea of prototype theory. Prototype theory, I like it a little bit. I like all of these theories, to be honest with you. As a cognitive psychologist, I like them all. But prototype theory, I think, is one of the ones that I really do enjoy quite a bit, because prototype theory expanded on the limitations of template theory. So essentially, template theory was saying, hey, you had these individual templates. Prototype theory was saying, hey, look, what we're going to do is we're going to take the average of all my experiences that I have out there in terms of this particular object, and I'm going to create something that I'm going to assume it to be a prototype. So in other words, I understand that out there in the world there may be so many different variations, and I've experienced so many different variations. I'm going to create something that is the typical or the prototypical idea of that object. So if I ever encounter anything that looks similar to that prototype, I'm going to consider it to be that object. So here, according to prototype theory, and what I like about it is it's giving you the ability to be able to integrate new features into your existing idea of what that object was. So you already have your knowledge, your memory. And then now you have this new experience, and it's a little bit different from that one that you had. Rather than creating a brand new separate file, you modified the file. So you still have one file with a modification. And that's nice, because now what we can do is anytime we encounter any situation that's similar to it, it's going to fall into that category and access that file, rather than having to create a brand new file system like template matching theory would have assumed here. So with prototype theory, we would look at this idea of pattern recognition, that we would look at the features of the object to be recognized, and if they overlap in some particular aspect with the features of the prototype, I'm going to say it is that prototype. I'm going to say it is that object. So in other words, I know that soccer balls are not all the same out there, right? That they are different. But hey, you know what? If it fits somewhat to the idea of what a soccer ball looks like, I'm probably going to identify it as a soccer ball. Am I going to potentially be wrong? Yeah, I may potentially be wrong from time to time, but ideally is if it's fitting into the same ideas, I'm going to label it as such. So rather than saying green Mustang, black Mustang, brown Mustang, orange Mustang, whatever the case may be, you're going to say Mustang, because you understand that within Mustangs, there's going to be so many different variations of color that even if it comes in different colors that you've never experienced, it's still going to be classified as a Mustang. You're never going to look at that vehicle and be like, I have no idea what that vehicle is. It's a very odd vehicle. I don't know, even though you've already experienced what a Mustang is in that particular case. So we don't really need an exact match to my template, like what template theory was proposing. So in my file, I don't have to have a very specific file for just green Mustang or for soccer ball black and white. Because what if they come in different colors? What if they come in different shapes, different sizes, etc., etc., etc.? Here now we can have this idea of taking the average and matching up any of those objects to that particular average. So between the knowledge that you actually have and that new stimulus is the way that you're going to create the recognition process. So I'm going to look at what I previously know. I'm going to look at that new object. I'm going to say, does it kind of fit into my idea, to that mold that I have, that prototype? Yes, go for it. Then it is going to be that. Am I going to be wrong sometimes? Probably. But hey, it's better for me to have an action than to not have an action at all. So according to template matching theory, if I didn't know what that object was, I would just stand there and be like, I can't have an action because I don't know what that object was. That's a problem. So prototype theory is very good at explaining why we have recognition of an object that we've never encountered in our past, but yet we're able to somewhat categorize it correctly. So according to template theory would have assumed that this would be the only template that I would have for a tricycle. Now, if the tricycle moved in any capacity, if it gave me a different perspective than what I had, according to template theory, I'm never going to recognize that. So here, template theory would have said, I'm never going to recognize that. Prototype theory, there's so many theories out there. Prototype theory is now saying, hey, this is the prototype that I have for this tricycle. Even though it may change in terms of its direction, in terms of its viewpoint, color, size, if it kind of fits the parameters associated with what it is that we assume to be a tricycle, we're going to label it as a tricycle. So here, even in situations that we may never encounter, we may still have the right action or an action that is good enough to get us by. So for instance, fixing a car. You've had the experience of potentially fixing a car in the past, basic aspects, and you're able to fix the problem at that point. But what if the car now breaks down in the future? If it's similar to the breakdown that you've had in the past, even though it may just be a little bit different, you may be able to do enough just to get by. Okay, that's kind of the idea here that we have with prototype theory, that you're going to have recognition and an action associated with that recognition process because you're able to function good enough to be able to know what to do in that situation and to identify what that object is to the best of your ability. All right, now let's move on to now talking about perception of speech. And before I leave, I guess the last bullet point that I had on here, and forgive me for not remembering, about exemplars. We have what are called exemplars in prototype theory. Exemplars are essentially ideas that we have that are examples of that particular object. So here, think of it as the overall larger category associated with that object. So soccer ball, play ball, baseball, and so on and so forth, that you had these examples and then all these other objects fit into those examples that we have. Essentially here, exemplars are our prototype, if you want to think about them. So now let's move into talking about perception of speech. So another issue that we have to consider is in terms of how we recognize other types of stimuli that exist in our world other than just what is visual in our nature. Now, granted, when we think about our world that we live in, much of the world we would say is probably more visual than anything else. But what happens in those situations where we cannot depend on visual stimuli to be able to process information, but rather we have to depend on other sensory systems, such as auditory systems, to be able to identify, number one, perceive, and then number two, identify or recognize what particular object or what particular stimulus it is that we're dealing with. So when we think about perception of language or perception of speech, speech really occurs at different levels. So when we think about speech, and this is kind of an idea that when we start thinking about what we're working with here in terms of speech, speech isn't just speech. Speech isn't as easy as we all think it is in the sense of, well, people speak, I understand it, I'm okay, I know the language. But in reality, there's so much processing that goes into this idea of trying to understand speech. So when we think about processing language and process what other people are talking about or what other people are saying, we actually go through a couple of different levels of representation first. Our first level of representation is what we call the auditory level. And essentially with the auditory level, we as the individual, since we are information processors, we first examine the signal or the stimulus, right, that auditory stimulus that's coming in. We examine it by its frequency, its intensity, and then temporal attributes associated with it. What do we mean by frequency, intensity, and temporal attributes? Frequency means how fast are these sound waves occurring for us. So when we think about language and when we think about how sounds are being produced, we think of them as functioning in waveforms. So if we look at language and the way that sounds are actually just produced, and then when we think about language, language are also sounds. Sounds are actually produced in the following form. We have these waves that are being produced. So a person begins to produce a sound, and we have the onset of that sound wave being produced for us. And then once the person terminates that sound, we have the conclusion of that sound wave. So ultimately what happens is when sounds are being produced, let that be language, or let that be like the slap on a desk, or let that be music that's playing in your earphones, or even my voice, the way that I'm producing it right now for you, is we actually have these sound waves being produced. So we have this high pressure points, and then we have these low pressure points that exist in terms of our sound production, or in terms of this stimulus that we've created. So the first task that we actually have to do in terms of processing a sound is we have to first examine the frequency associated with the production of these sound waves. Now, what do we mean by the production of these sound waves in terms of its frequency? We're talking about how often these sound waves occur. Now, many times you've probably heard of the idea of hertz. And whenever it is that you hear about hertz when it refers to language, or sorry, when it refers to sounds, hertz refers to the frequency of these waves being produced. Okay, so we talk about megahertz and things like that. So essentially here we're talking about how fast these waveforms can actually be produced. Now, one of the things that we find is that the higher that we actually have the hertz, so the more hertz that we have, it means that there's more waves being produced per second or by millisecond or whatever the case may be. So here, for instance, we would say, for example, we're going to have 50 hertz. Okay, and this is just an example. Is this really 50 hertz that I'm using? Probably not, but I'm just giving this as an example. So 50 hertz occurs at these specific rates. These high and low pressure points are being created at 50 hertz. Now, what happens whenever it is that we have higher hertz, or we have something that looks like 100 hertz? Well, if we have something that looks like 100 hertz, and here just let me change the pen color very quickly. There we go. If we have something that's 100 hertz would look something like the following. We would have faster production being created by the sound. Okay, if we go 200 hertz, it would be faster, faster, faster. 300 hertz, even faster than that, and so on and so forth. Now, what is hertz related to, and frequency? Frequency and hertz are related to what we call pitch. So whenever it is that we think about the psychological property associated with frequency of these sound waves being produced, we have what is called pitch. What is pitch? We have this idea of our voices, for instance. People who have very low voices, so for example, the sounds that they make, they have lower pitches. So what does that mean? They're producing hertz at a lower intensity, or at a lower frequency. Now, for a person who has a very high-pitched voice, that kind of individual, they're producing sound waves at a faster rate. So in other words, they're going to be approximating something that's going to be closer potentially to something like 100 hertz, because the frequency of these sound waves are occurring much faster. So when we think about the psychological property associated with this idea of how frequently we create these sound waves, we're talking about the psychological property of pitch. In hertz and frequency, we talk about the physical properties. So hertz and frequency just relate to the psychological principle associated with pitch when we think about language or we think about sounds. So even think about, again, for instance, in a piano, the keys to the left of the piano, very deep sounds because they're resonating at a different hertz. So in other words, their hertz is going to be lower than the keys that are towards the higher end because they have a higher pitch. That means that they're vibrating a lot faster. So when you press the key, the chord vibrates a lot faster to be able to produce that high-pitched sound. That's ultimately what we're doing. So that's the first thing that we do. Next, we talk about intensity. Intensity, what does that relate to? We talk about amplitude. That's what intensity refers to, amplitude. What does that mean? For us psychologically, amplitude and intensity mean loudness. That's what that refers to, so the loudness aspect. So whenever we say that's really loud, we really should be saying the intensity is really high or the amplitude is really high. Now, how do we actually determine amplitude or this idea of loudness in terms of our waves? The higher the wave is, so the higher the high pressure point and the lower the low pressure point, means that the stronger the sound stimulus. So ultimately, whenever it is that we have a sound stimulus that looks like the following, that's going to be considered to be louder than something that looks like this. Okay? Because here we have more of that sound actually being produced for us. Last, we talk about temporal attributes. We talk about the order of sound. So what sounds are coming prior to other orders. So when I speak, certain sounds have to come prior to other sounds, so that way, whatever it is that I'm going to be communicating with you can follow along in that specific order, and it leads to you understanding whatever it is that we're discussing at that particular point. We also talk about the phonetic level of representation whenever it is that we talk about perception of speech. Essentially, here we talk about the identification of individual phones. What are phones? Here we're not talking about telephones, so don't think about that. Individual phones, or phones in themselves, phones are what we consider to be the smallest units of sound. Now, phones do not contribute to meaning. So these sounds that we're producing do not contribute to meaning in any capacity. They are just the smallest units of sounds. Now, we also look at the phonological level. The phonological level is the phonetic segment converted into phonemes, and phonological rules are now applied. Now, what does this mean? Once it is that we've determined the individual sounds that are being produced for us, now what we do is we combine those sounds together, and when we combine phones together, they produce what we call phonemes. Phonemes, the way that we define it, are the smallest units of sound that contribute to meaning. So in other words, when we pronounce certain sounds in our language, even though we may not produce the entire sound, the segments of those sounds are going to be enough for us to lead to identification of meaning. So here, if we have individual sounds, but they don't lead to meaning, we're going to call those phones. When you combine phones together, they lead to phonemes. All right, very, very important. Now we then apply the phonological rules. What are phonological rules? That the sounds that we are combining together, so those phones, when we combine those together, they should combine appropriately together. Now you're probably asking yourself, okay, so you're telling me that when a person talks, I'm going through all of this? And the answer is yes. Are you aware that you're going through all of this? And the answer is no. Why? Because it would take you way, way too long to be able to say, okay, first let me try to understand the frequency, the hertz. Next, let me think about the amplitude. Next, the temporal attributes. Next, what are the individual phones? Next, what are the individual phonemes? And the phonological rules, are they correct? No, we really don't say that kind of thing. Rather, what we say is we just say, yeah, okay, that sounds right. Yeah, that sounds right. The way they pronounce that information sounds correct. And you are absolutely correct. That's exactly what you're doing. But at a deeper level of processing here, more of an unconscious process, we are actually providing, or we're processing all these pieces of information. So cognitively, we're doing a lot of work trying to understand what a person is saying whenever it is that they're producing sounds for us. So when we think about trying to understand speech, humans really do require a lot of top-down processing whenever it is that we're communicating with other people. So very rarely in terms of a conversation will you find an instance where you don't know what the primary topic was and then everything else of what you're communicating seems to fit into that topic. But if you go into a situation where you don't know what the topic of conversation is, the words that they're saying, even the sounds that they're producing, sometimes you're gonna be like, I have no idea what it is that these people are saying. So are you telling me then that you don't understand words, that you can't comprehend the message? And the answer is no, you actually still can comprehend the message, but the message may not seem to make sense because you don't have the knowledge of what they're actually talking about. So it's like jumping into a conversation that you had no idea what was going on. Same thing is happening here. So in reality, for us to really understand speech, we actually have to have this general ideas of, okay, well, these people normally talk about these things, so I'm going to assume then that what they're talking about is that specific topic. So then you jump into the conversation and they use some of the words that you would assume would be part of that topic, and you're like, yes, that seems to be about right. So ultimately, we really do want to use top-down knowledge. We really do want to have guided knowledge really directing us rather than us using bottom-up processing. Because imagine us going into a conversation every single time and working our way from the bottom up. That's a very, very difficult, very cognitively taxing process here, trying to identify what the overall larger picture is. But rather, if you already have the info, it's a lot easier for us to actually work our way to saying, okay, yeah, everything else that's being communicated with me seems to work in that particular instance. Now, when we think about theories associated with speech perceptions, what must a good theory associated with speech perception really account for? And the answer is the following. When we think about speech perception, a good theory, number one, has to account for speed of communication. So one of the things that we have to consider is that when we actually produce speech, and here when we say that we produce speech, so how many words can we actually produce per minute? We produce somewhere about 400 words per minute on average. This is a normal person. So producing 400 words a minute, that's a lot of words that we're actually producing. So how long do you actually talk to a person for? How long has my lecture been going on? I've been talking for over an hour and 10 minutes. So in this particular case, I've been producing somewhere around 400 words a minute for over an hour and 10 minutes. So over 70 minutes, I've been producing 400 words per minute. That's a lot of words. So here, out of all of it, you still have to understand and keep up with me in terms of trying to understand what I'm talking about. Now, granted, some of the information that I'm using or some of the terms that I may be using may not necessarily be relevant to you yet, or you still may not understand them fully, but yet we're still working on trying to use those particular terms and trying to have that knowledge so that way we can comprehend a lot more easily. Now, when we think about this aspect of speech perception, we have to think again, going back to some of our theories. So even though we talked about, for instance, recognition by components theory, in this particular instance, it's not relevant because we're not talking about visual representations or visual recognition. But here, for instance, if you look at something like template theory actually would propose also that of the things that it could account for was this idea of understanding speech as well. So just as what template theory proposed when we talked about visual recognition, that we would store these templates of individual images that we encounter or individual visual representations, template theory proposed the exact same thing here. That what we would do is we would store individual files or individual segments associated with phonemes or phones even in certain instances, that we would say, hey, you know what, the individual sound segments, even though they don't contribute to meaning, I'm still going to store that. And then I'm going to combine those files together to be able to produce phonemes. And then when I combine phonemes together, I'm going to be able to then have a word, and I'm going to store that word. But then the problem that we encountered with this idea of template theory is, well, what happens when we can use the same word in a different context? Or that there's different situations that a word may potentially be used, and they have very different pronunciations, but yet they're written the exact same way. So for instance, if we look at the following word, we're going to write this word here. Okay, if you're reading that word, the majority of you probably read that word and you say to yourself, project. And you're absolutely right. That is my intention of me writing that. But is there another way that we could actually produce this word? So another way that we could actually say this word? And the answer is yes. We would also say project. So here in both project and project, we use the exact same spelling of this word. Template theory would have told me, well, when I see this particular combination of letters being given to me, I'm going to assume here then that that word is going to be project, because that's what I've learned. But now you're in a situation where you are talking about projecting something, so we need to project, how sales are going to be within 6 months. Perfect. You're using the right term, but yet you're still using it in terms of the same spelling. According to template theory, you would have never understood what project was because you only have project. And one of these would have to win. Project would have to win, or if you're going to use project, project would then override project, because there's different words that are being used. Because according to template theory, you couldn't store two files that are identical to each other, because the only thing that would then differ is the way that you actually produce them. So here, when we think about speech comprehension, we have to think about a good theory that would account for the idea that we have the same words sometimes that are being used in different contexts, and we still understand them. We still use them appropriately, and no one says to you, nope, that's project, not project, even though you're talking about projecting scores that may potentially, or sales that may be happening within 6 months. So when we think about a good theory associated with speech production, speed is going to be crucial to us, because sometimes we are producing speech too quickly to be able to continue to match up to these potential templates that we're also working with. We saw that exact same argument when we talked about visual recognition, that sometimes you have information coming in too quickly and it's just taking you too long to go through all the files on your computer, or here in terms of your brain, in terms of your memory bank, to look through them all and say, okay, which one is it? But rather we have to account for this idea of speed. Now here I want to show you very, very quickly a video that looks at this idea of speech comprehension, and I just want you to quickly be able to view it and then be able to identify what is it that's being said. All right, so here's our video. We're going to look at an auctioneer for a livestock competition. So here, just about every year, the World Livestock Auctioneer Competition occurs here in the United States, where we have individuals who are doing livestock auctions, and they speak very, very quickly. So here it's very important for us to try to understand as much as we can from them as they're producing speech. Everyone ready? Here we go.
Welcome back to the 51st Annual World Livestock Auctioneer Championship. As we get ready for the finals, Kyle, what would the judges have been looking for today?
Well, a panel of 5 judges score the interview competition. The judging criteria for the interview are personal presentation, clarity with which the individual expresses himself, and knowledge of the livestock industry. The interview accounts for 25% of the semifinal and final rounds. A separate panel of 5 judges, all LMA member auction market operators, will score the live portion of the event as well.
In the semifinal round, each contestant sold 8 drafts. This is an actual sale with live bidders in the seats. This will count for 75% of their score. Their criteria is clarity of chant, bid catching ability, execution of sale, and finally, would I hire this auctioneer?
With the scores totaled, we'll head into the final round, where the top 10 finalists will sell an additional 10 drafts of cattle. We're closing in on that championship. Let's take a look at the first 5 finalists on the auction block. First in the finals today, Brandon Neely from Southside Alabama, a native of Berkeley Springs, West Virginia.
Yes, and I first met Brandon back in 2007 when he qualified in one of the first LMA qualifiers. And glad to see him here and in the final.
195.50 and 95 and a half here, 95 and a half, 95 and a half, 196 here, now half, and here's 797 at the bar to the mound, 50 here, 80 to the bar to the bid, 98 and a half, now 9, and 99.50, 99 and a half to the bar to the bid. You want to try a quarter now? 199 to the damn quarter, 199 to the damn half here, 99 to the got you now, 75, 1 down 2, 2 to the bid, down 2 quarter, 9 here, down half here, 2 down 50 down, 75 to the damn 1, and 2 1, I am 1 to the damn quarter, 2 1 to the damn quarter, down half here, 2 1 50, and now 75, 2 1 75 to the damn 2, 2 and a quarter, 220 to the damn half, and 250 down, 75 to the damn 3, 2 3 and a quarter, 9 3 to the and a quarter half, and 2 3 50, 2 3 20 to the damn half here, 223 quarter half, and 2 3 20 to the damn 50 here, quarter half to the bar to the bound, 3 quarter half to the bar to the 3 quarter half. So to get
All right, so I want to go ahead and stop that video just because within that, 30, 40 seconds that that individual produced speech for us, we can see that he actually produced his speech a lot faster than just 400 words per minute, but rather he's going at probably 600, 700 words per minute. And here it starts becoming very, very difficult for us to understand what is happening. To be honest, I tried keeping up as best as I could with it, and I watched this video over and over and over again. And I can get I think quarter is the best that I can possibly get. If I was bidding, I think I would be bidding for the wrong thing, or I would be trying to outbid myself, to be honest with you. So it's very, very difficult for us to understand him because, again, we are so accustomed to this idea of, well, we have a rate of speech that we normally communicate with individuals. But rather now that all of a sudden we have much more information coming in, it's a lot harder for us to be able to account for all that information and trying to get as much as we can out. But rather, we just start picking out specific pieces of information that we start saying, well, I think this is important, I think this is important, I think this is important, and everything else, I'm just going to let it go to waste because I don't even know what's happening and I cannot keep up at that point. Now, the second issue here that we must consider in terms of any good speech theory is we have to look at the idea of meaning behind the words. That's what the idea of semantics. Semantics refers to the idea of meaning. What do the words refer to? And we also have to think about this idea of the context that we're working in. So in our previous slide here that we were talking about looking at all the different levels of processing and that it was very important for us to have top-down knowledge prior to going into a conversation with an individual because in that way the words that they would be using would match up to the ideas that we already had in mind. So here, any good speech theory has to account for this idea that normally we're going to be working with context. We're going to be working with already an idea of what we think a conversation is about. So here, in many instances, one of the things that we find is that if we find that words appear in isolation, it's actually quite difficult for us to identify what the overall meaning is. So whenever it is that a person just randomly comes up to us and says to us, hey, apple. Great, I know what an apple is, I know that it's a fruit, I know I can eat it, but what about it? I really don't know too much. But rather here, if we have a little bit more information that's being given to us and you are at a grocery store and somebody says to you, apple, now all of a sudden the term apple starts meaning a lot more things. Maybe they're looking for apple, so on and so forth. Or apples where? Now I got more information and I'm able to work with that person. Now here, one of the things that we also find is that we have this very interesting phenomenon that we call the word superiority effect. And essentially what the word superiority effect provides for us or has demonstrated for us is that it's easier for us to be able to identify letters that exist inside of words that are real words rather than letters that are just inside of strings of letters. So in our particular case, for instance, if we were to ask you, find the K in the following strings of letters, it's actually a lot easier for you to be able to find the K in work rather than the K in W-R-I-K. And the reason for that is because you start, whenever it is that you read, you start looking at those letters and you start saying to yourself, okay, I kind of know that pattern. I know what words normally begin with a W. And you start now thinking to yourself, okay, I'm looking for a K and I have a W. What are some potential words that I know that have a W and a K? Can I be able to find that? And one of them that might pop up for you is the idea of work. So it's much easier for you to be able to identify work and identify the K in work rather than the K in W-R-I-K, even though they both exist in the exact same spot. Because here, W-R-I-K is going to make you work a little bit more, haha, right? Funny part, work. So here, W-R-I-K is going to make you work a little bit harder at trying to process all the information because you're going to say W-R? I don't even know any letters or any words that begin with WR. So here it makes it very, very difficult for us to be able to identify that letter correctly in this specific situation. We do hope that the majority of the information that we're working with is really going to be top-down driven. So in other words, we already have the previous knowledge associated with the situation. We really expect then that we're able to make changes to situations and still be able to lead people to different conclusions. Now, one of the ways that we were able to do this is through some experimental research studies in which use the following sentence here. Now, you'll notice here that we have an asterisk being replaced or replacing a particular phoneme. In this particular case, the phoneme that we're replacing can be a very ambiguous phoneme. Now, if you notice here towards the end of the sentence, I've given you some other options. So it says axle or shoe. Now, one of the great things that the group of researchers did is they essentially were trying to test what's now called the phonemic restoration effect. The phonemic restoration effect essentially predicts that even though we may have some sounds that contribute to meaning being eliminated or that we aren't able to catch while an individual is speaking with us, we are still able to process that information and still come to the accurate conclusion. So even though I don't have all the information in every single sound that's being given to me, I'm still able to process some of that deeper information and still able to actually create my own illusion that that information was actually given there. So essentially what my mind is going to do is it's going to fill in the blank. So this is one of the things that I talked about last week, that one of the things that we really don't like is we really don't like to have gaps in our memory. We really don't like to have these kind of little spots that we say, well, I don't really know what that information was. So rather what we do is we fill in that information so that way we're able to then be able to say efficiently, I know the entire story, or I'm able to fill in as much information as I possibly can so that everything makes sense for me in my world. So essentially what the group of researchers did is they would present this particular sentence with this little asterisk being presented, but here everything is auditory in its nature, so not visual, so it's just auditory. And what the group of researchers found is that whenever it is that they produce this mask, which is represented here by this asterisk, and they change the ending of the sentence, people heard different things. So for instance, here, if we say axle is going to be the end of the sentence, So here you're going to ignore the word shoe. So here, if we had the eel was on the axle, people would hear wheel. Now, if we change that to say the eel was on the shoe, now people would say, oh, it was heel. So that's what they would report. Now we would also do this, for instance, with orange. And people would say the eel was on the orange. And they would say, well, then it's peel. So here, even though we only have one sound being masked, but all we did was just change the ending of the sentence, it actually changed people's perceptions of what that missing sound was. And this is an incredible idea, and it's an incredible result that we continuously find, that people fill in the gaps. This is a very, very normal thing. And why is it that people fill in the gaps? Because we don't like to have this missing information, but rather we like to think that we have a clear picture of our entire world, but yet in reality that doesn't really happen. So rather we hear a story and then we sometimes don't know all the information, but now we're repeating that story to other people and we fill it in with what we think is there. This is kind of like the idea of the telephone game, if you've ever played that you say one thing to one person and then as you continue to say those things to another person, by the time it gets to the very end of that line, it's a completely different message than the one that actually began. Why does that happen? Because each person now starts missing some of the information that the previous person gave them, and they start filling in because they're trying to give them as much as a message that we possibly can. So by the time it actually gets to the last one, the last person is listening to this completely jarbled message that's coming through all these different individuals that everyone's filling in the information because not everyone's giving it complete. So it becomes a very, very big problem for us. Now here I'm going to present you with an auditory example of the phonemic restoration effect, because this, again, B, is actually known as the phonemic restoration effect. And I'm going to play this clip for you that actually is going to show you two different ways that the phoneme was actually masked. One, there's going to be a cough, and then one, it's just not going to have any sound. It's just going to have a missing piece of information while the sentence is being read to you. So in one instance, that phoneme is going to be masked with a cough, and then in another instance it's going to be masked with no information, so it's just going to be empty time. But you're still going to hear the exact same sentence being produced in both situations, and you're going to hear it in its entirety, and it's going to sound like if you're not missing any information. All right, so here we go. Let's try this out.
The state governors met with their respective legislatures convening in the capital city. The state governors met with their respective legislatures convening in the capital city. The state governors met with their respective legislatures convening in the capital city. The state governors met with their respective legislatures the state governors met with their respective legislatures convening in the capital city. The state governors met with their respective legislatures convening in the capital city. The state governors met with their respective legislatures convening in the capital.
All right, so there we see that in both situations, the one with the cough and the one that doesn't have the cough, we still are able to hear the sentence in its entirety, and it doesn't seem like if there's any missing information. So in reality, if you think about the one with the cough, how many times in your real world does another sound mask a sound during a conversation? And the answer is pretty frequently. Cell phones are ringing, people are coughing, people are talking over you, there's people honking their horns. There's a whole bunch of different sounds that are out there in the world, and sometimes these sounds get masked. If we mask or if we delete enough of that sound or enough of those sounds in a word, well, then it's going to become very difficult for us to extract the correct word. But here in this particular instance, we only mask or we delete one particular sound, and yet it still leads us to the exact same conclusion. This demonstrates for us an incredible event, an incredible phenomenon that we have in cognitive psychology that really does demonstrate to us the importance of us filling in that missing information. So when we think about good speech perception theories, what are we really trying to account for? We're trying to account for a lot. The speed of production, the speed of comprehension. We're also trying to understand the meaning of words and also the context that we're putting those words in. And sometimes the context that we're using them in changes drastically the interpretation of what it is that we are actually going to be recognizing in this particular instance. So even though we're perceiving the same thing in different instances, like in this case with the eel was on the axle and the eel was on the shoe, in both situations you're still perceiving the same information. The only thing that changes is just one key content word, changing the context completely, thus changing the interpretation of what that missing sound was, thus changing the meaning of the word. And that's an incredible, incredible finding for us. For any of you who watch, for instance, Jimmy Kimmel, Jimmy Kimmel has this great segment on his TV late night talk show that he has. It's called Unnecessary Censorship. And unnecessary censorship plays on this idea of the phonemic restoration effect, that whenever it is that they bleep or blurt specific sounds out from the content of an individual speech, it changes the meaning completely, normally inappropriately, to something that sounds very, very inappropriate, but it changes your perception, and you say, oh man, I can't believe they said that, when in reality, of course they didn't say that it was on television or it was on live TV or whatever the case was. But by ignoring that information, by bleeping that information, it now completely changes the meaning of the message that's being transmitted. So if you guys get an opportunity, go on Google or go on YouTube and do Unnecessary Censorship by Jimmy Kimmel, and you'll get quite a big laugh out of it because it plays on this same illusion. I know that's kind of a nerdy thing for me to say, right? That's like, ooh, it's an awesome psychological phenomenon that they're using in the popular media, but it's a very, very good example. All right. So when we think about reading and pattern recognition, one of the interesting things that we find whenever it is that we read is that it's really not necessary for us to read every single letter and then try to identify the word that we're actually using. You'll find a whole lot of different theories out there in the world that say things like, oh, you only read the first and the last letter in a word, so that way, you're not spending too much time in the middle. So you can really drop out what's in the middle portion of the word and then be able to continue on. And in reality, that's not necessarily accurate, because if we think about our eyes doing the same thing as what we were looking at with the phonemic restoration effect, we would assume then that if we have a lot of missing information, especially like the middle of a word, so for instance, if you were reading recognition and we only gave you the R and the N, or even R, G, and N, but we didn't give you anything else in the middle, it would actually make it very, very difficult for you to read. Now, in some instances, you can provide enough information, even though you eliminate some of those particular letters, in terms of their character, but yet we still need some of that information to be able to process that information there accurately. Next week, when I talk to you guys about attention, we're going to look at how our eyes actually move during reading. We're going to look at how our actual eyes read and how we go back and we go forward and we scan and we rescan information. So in reality, it's quite necessary for us to have all the letters in the word, especially if there's any confusion that may arise. But yet, when we actually look at the way that we read, we don't need to recognize every single individual letter. We just recognize the pattern of those letters in the order that they're in, and you make the assumption. But as many of you have probably ever encountered, while you're reading, sometimes you read a sentence and you're like, what? That didn't make any sense. And you have to go back and reread it. And you're like, oh, I totally misread that word. Well, why? Well, because again, you were reading that word, a couple of those letters at the beginning seemed to draw you to a specific conclusion of what the word was supposed to be, and it led you down the wrong path. So then you get to the end of the sentence and you're like, that didn't make any sense because that one key content word may have been potentially misinterpreted or miscommunicated to you in that particular instance. So it's very, very important that when we read, we try to pay as much attention, but again, it's not necessarily necessary for us to read every single individual letter, but at least it's there to kind of guide us in case we ever need that information that's there. That we're going to be talking about for this lecture is we're going to be talking about facial recognition. Now, when we think about the real world, facial recognition is probably one of the processes that we least think about and that we least give importance to, but in reality, it's such an important issue for us to consider. Why is it that facial recognition is so important? Well, because facial recognition is going to drive who it is that we talk to, who we create in terms of our social circles, who it is that we communicate specific information to, how we communicate that information as well. So it's very important that when we're out there in the real world, you don't incorrectly identify an individual by saying that they're somebody else. And most of us have actually done that we are in the real world and we look at somebody and we're like, oh, it's so and so. And you go up to them and you say hi or you wave at them and then you're like, oh, nope, totally was not them. And you feel very embarrassed, very awkward. Now, part of that awkwardness or that embarrassment is because you feel, well, I've made a mistake and I feel really bad that I mistook that individual for another and I may have potentially bothered them or now I potentially look bad in front of them. But in reality, sometimes facial recognition can go awry because we have difficulties in terms of distinguishing individuals. Because sometimes we do have individuals that look very, very similar to each other, but yet they're completely different people. You know, sometimes we say that all of us have doppelgangers out there in the world. Just to give you an example of this, my wife and I, we had gone on vacation. And my wife had asked me if we could go to the theater, you know, to watch a play. And I said, sure. So we went to go watch a play. And both her and I turned to our right at the exact same moment. And we looked at this gentleman. And I'm not lying to you guys, it was my complete doppelganger. It was my twin. But I don't have a twin. He looked just like me, identical. And I just stared at him and I was in disbelief that there was somebody else out there that was as good looking as me. Now, that's a joke, guys. I'm really not that good looking. But I looked at him and I thought to myself, what? Like, how is that person there that looks just like me? And even my wife started, and my wife looked back at me and she goes, I totally thought that was you for a second. I said, me too. I said, I totally thought that was me. I was like, for a minute there, I actually thought I was looking in a mirror. And then I was just kind of looking at myself and I was like, that's so weird because I'm looking in that direction, but he's looking forward. I was like, this is very, very odd. But it turned out that it was just a person who looked just like me. But it could have been potentially awkward for my wife, for instance. She would have gone up to him and been like, hey, how's it going? And I don't know what, you know, thinking that she was talking to me, but yet it was a completely different person. So it's very important that when we're out there in the real world, we recognize a person's face for who it is that they are, and we do not make the mistake. So when we look at people's faces, we actually try to draw patterns. So when you're looking at a person, especially the very first times, one of the first things that you're trying to do with them is you're trying to scan their face as much as you can and try to process as much information as you can and create a pattern for that person. Because even though no matter how identical individuals may potentially be, especially identical twins, sometimes there's just a fraction of a difference that can change the pattern and identification. I have a friend, for instance, that she has a twin and it's an identical twin. And they look just, I mean, the same. When we met them initially, I mean, we would get them confused all the time. But their family, for instance, knew how to distinguish them. And we would say to each other, how is it that you are able to know who's this person, who's that person? And they would say, oh, we just know. But it's not just because they know, but rather because there are small distinct differences between even those identical twins that lead people to be able to identify, especially the ones who have had enough experience with them, to be able to distinguish them correctly. Now that we've known them for 5 years and we spend lots and lots of time together with both of them, now we're able to accurately identify the differences between the two. That even though they look still identical as they are, my wife and I look at them and we say, oh, that's so and so and that's so and so, and we're able to make that distinction. And now people come to us and they say, how do you even know? Because what we're doing is we're studying a person's face. That's what we do. We're information processors. We're scanning that person's face, trying to make a pattern of what it is that they look like. So when we look at facial recognition, we find that with children, for instance, even at a very young age, as infants, we find that infants, even between the 2 to 3 weeks of age, we find that they are able to mimic individuals' faces, looking at an individual's face and being able to recognize what that facial construction looks like or what that pattern looks like and being able to mimic it. So it's very, very important that when we look at an individual's face, we try to process it as best as we can, and we try to think to ourselves that this is the person that we may potentially be encountering in the future. Now, for instance, for myself, I was doing the calculations just the other day in terms of all my years of teaching at universities. It's been about 10 years now at this point. So in 2016, it's been about 10 or 11 years that I've been teaching at universities. And I don't know, I've probably taught somewhere about 7,000 students, somewhere around there. And when I look at people's faces now, sometimes I get really confused. And I have people who come up to me all the time and they say, hi, Dr. Lagarza, how are you? And I'm like, oh man, like I don't not recognize you. And they're like, I was in your class, don't you remember? And I'm like, I'm sure you are, or that you were in my class, but I'm really sorry. Like, especially with a sea of faces sometimes that you have 200-300 students in the classes that I used to have back in the day, that it made it very, very difficult. Nowadays that I have, 10, 15 students in a class, it's great. I'm able to really remember people's faces and take them in. But then even imagine 20 years down the line where I'm going to be saying, well, how many students have I gone through now that I've taught and that I've looked at their faces and tried to remember their names? It makes it very, very difficult. But yet with children, we find that imitation is a key ability that they have even from very, very early on when they're born. We even see this with infants that at very early ages, they tend to even select who it is that they go with, that they have even stranger anxiety or that they have separation anxiety from a parent, for instance, or a caregiver very early on in their lives. And you would say to yourself, well, they're so small, how do they even know the difference between individuals? By looking at their faces, even though they are still very, very tiny, they're still able to look at those differences and say to themselves, this pattern I've never recognized, thus it must not be somebody that I know. And if you actually look at infants look at your face a lot. They'll look straight at your face for a very long time. It's almost like if they're studying you. So it's very, very, it's a very awesome experience to see what it is that they actually do. One of the things that we've actually done in terms of research in the field of cognitive psychology is looked at how we actually have imitation occurring from infants from infants to adults. There you go. So in other words, how do infants mimic the behaviors of the adults, especially in terms of the face? So how it is that they're able to make that imitation in terms of the facial recognition that they're doing. So if you look on the first graph, figure A versus figure B, in figure A, you'll notice that they have what are called tongue protrusions, and essentially here what's happening is the infant's behavior is mimicking what the adult is doing. So in figure A, the adult is having tongue protrusions, and the infant is able to do those as well, and they do them quite frequently. In figure B here, the infant or the adult is doing a lot of mouth openings, and the infant is also mimicking that specific behavior there. So here, for instance, doing these in that particular case, so A and B in this particular instance. So we can see that they tend to mimic that behavior quite frequently. So when we see that there's this idea of facial recognitions, why would facial recognition be so important to us? If we think from an evolutionary standpoint, it's really that we have this biological mechanism that we all really do share that allows us to be able to recognize individuals' faces. Why would we need to be able to do that? Well, especially if you think about prehistoric times, if there were individuals who were either going to be your allies or potentially going to be your enemies, you better hope that you were going to be able to recognize them efficiently. Even for infants, why is it that infants would need to be able to recognize an individual's face very quickly? Well, because if an individual is not somebody who's their potential caregiver or their primary caregiver in that instance, or their parent, whatever the case may be, the mother or the father, the child may potentially then indicate that to an individual by saying, hey, this is not somebody that I know, and they take that in the form of crying. So it seems that it's a very vital component to success in terms of our survival. And that's why even in some instances where we see that there's situations with like kidnappings that are very, very sad, where individuals abduct children, why is it that sometimes they abduct children? Because sometimes there's a familiarity between the face of the individual and a potential caregiver that the child may have. And there's also, again, sometimes, rewards that are given to the children, and then they're potentially kidnapped in those situations that are very, very sad. But yet there are sometimes similarities, and you sometimes do hear that from also reports from the children, that they look like my grandfather, they look like my grandmother. I remember just a couple of months ago, we were at the grocery store with my daughter, and I lost track of my daughter for a tenth of a second. I was like, where did she go? And she was right behind me, but she went and she grabbed the hand of an old man who was standing behind me, and he was buying peanut butter, and he kind of gave her like this look of like, I don't know you, and she grabbed his hand. And then I was like, hey, Alicia, like that's not anybody that you know. Come over here, like that's a stranger. And I asked her, she's 3 right now, and I said, why did you go and grab his hand? She said, he looked like my granddad. And I was like, oh. And I looked at him and I was like, not really. I was like, but I'll give it to you, I guess a little bit. He's older. And that's why she went with him. She was like, oh, I thought he was my granddad. So for her, she saw his face, recognized some component, and said, yeah, that must be somebody that I know. It's a very, very scary time, but ultimately, I was very happy that I was there to be able to say, yeah, let's go, please. Please don't go with that old man. So in these specific instances, when we see that facial recognition is so important, especially and critical to our survival, it's important for us to have adequate facial recognition. Well, are there situations that we do not have adequate facial recognition? And the answer is yes. We actually find that there are parts of our brain that are actually designed specifically to help us for facial recognition. So we actually have a part of our brain that's highlighted right here for you, this orange area that's right here. It's actually called the fusiform gyrus. And the fusiform gyrus, we found that is actually very, very important for facial recognition. And we also find that in some particular instances, individuals may suffer from damage to that specific area of the brain, and thus may lead to potential problems that do not allow them to be able to have facial recognition. So for some individuals, we find that at the neurological level, they have difficulty recognizing faces because of damage to this specific area. And we also find that it's called prosopagnosia. And we also sometimes call this facial blindness or face blindness. And for these individuals who suffer from prosopagnosia or face blindness, actually have an inability to recognize faces. So it's a very, very sad and deteriorating condition in which an individual is unable to recognize anybody, even if they're close individuals, wives, kids, parents, grandparents. These individuals, unfortunately, are unable to recognize an individual's face. And it's a very, very sad and debilitating disorder that individuals may potentially develop because of brain injuries, for instance, or strokes, or other instances of brain damage. But these individuals, unfortunately, are unable to recognize an individual's face. Now, with that being said, are they able then to not know who that person is? And the answer is no. They actually may know who that person is. It's just that the pattern that the face is making is not something that's generating the memory back from their knowledge. So remember, anything that we are experiencing with any of our sensory systems, let that be our eyes, tongue, nose, ears, hands, anything else that we're using as sensory systems, here what we're doing is we're taking physical stimuli from our world, we're creating electricity. That electricity then goes to the appropriate brain area for processing. In this particular case, with facial recognition, what we're doing is we're looking at a person's face, we're converting the physical properties and the pattern of their face into electrical energy. That electrical energy then gets taken to the brain for processing, and in the brain, we should process that information accurately, and we should take out that information, that previous knowledge, as to who it is that we're dealing with. so that way we can have the appropriate action and continue to formulate new knowledge and new memories. So for these individuals, what's happening? Well, potentially there may be a breakdown in terms of the way that they actually recognize a person's face. So in terms of the pattern that's being created, the electricity that's going to be generated at the transduction and the transmission point may potentially already be faulty. So the pattern it creates may be faulty. Or once it gets to the actual to the part of the brain that's processing for facial recognition, in this particular case, that we were just showing you there, the fusiform gyrus. If we look at the fusiform gyrus and we notice that there's damage to that area, we may then have difficulties extracting information that suggests that, hey, this is who that person's supposed to be. So in other words, once the signal gets to the fusiform gyrus, the signal then gets jarbled up and the wrong information gets pulled out. And the individual just may say, well, I don't know who they are, or they may confuse them for somebody completely different. Now, for these individuals, can they use other cues to try to help identify who that person is? And the answer is yes. Smell helps, touch helps, and also sound helps quite frequently. So the person's voice helps them to be able to identify. So normally what we find with these individuals who have prosopagnosia, and here when we say people who have prosopagnosia, we're not talking about millions and millions and millions of people. It's a very, very rare disorder, but there are individuals who have prosopagnosia. For these individuals who have prosopagnosia, generally what we find is that one method to help them cope with the situation that they're in is to not look at people's faces, or even blindfold them in some situations, or even dimming the lights where they're not able to look at the person's face, and just rely on other sensory cues to be able to help them with identification. All right, so that wraps up our discussion for pattern recognition and visual and auditory recognition, or chapter 2 of our textbook. Just a couple quick notes that I've posted on Blackboard for you. Number one, make sure to complete your quiz for this particular week. Also, make sure to complete your discussion board for this particular week. I've also made some notes in regards to other chapters that we'll be covering and some minor changes that I'm going to be doing to the schedule. So if you have the chance to take a look at all that, please do make sure to look at that information. All right. Have a good rest of your week. Please let me know if you have any questions, and I hope you guys are having a great time learning about cognitive psychology.